Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our presenter today. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days for any rewatches you want to do. I disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Rachel Hansen, is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the presenter at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not get to all the questions before we end today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter. Mike Day is the senior editorial artist and designer at the Telegraph Herald in Dubuque, Iowa. Mike is a graduate of Loras College and has put his commercial design and expository writing major to good use during his 37 years at the newspaper. He was able to pursue his original career goal of drawing cartoons and expanded his skill set to include graphics, page design, writing, photography, and videography. Mike has used his position at the paper to explore and present many in-depth stories of local history, including the deadly Union Park flash flood in 1919, a turn-of-the-century amusement park on the Mississippi River Island, an 1889 Dubuque Carnival, the city's short-lived turn hosting a women's professional baseball team in 1951, and Dubuque's golden age of drive-ins. During the past decade, he has coordinated the publication of over a half dozen books that resurrected Telegraph Herald photos, some never even published, from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Mike has won numerous awards for his work, which includes his recent magazines spotlighting one-room schools and the area ballrooms. And now I'm happy to turn over to Mike to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome, fellow history buffs. I'm honored to be asked to share my work here today. Just a little background. For the past few years, I've had the privilege of putting together some nostalgia-themed magazines for the Telegraph Herald. In 2022, I featured one-room schools. This year, I profiled area cafes and drive-ins. For this presentation, I'll be sharing my research on dance halls and bands from the golden age of ballrooms. We have a lot to cover, so apologies if I talk too fast. I'll try to keep it one notch below auctioneer mode. One of the weekly features we publish at the newspaper is called Love That Lasts, and it's written by Michelle London. These stories spotlight couples married 50 years or more, and it's kind of a little running joke in the newsroom. It seems that more often than not, these men and women first met at one of the local dance halls. So these places hold special meaning for a lot of folks from that generation, and they served really an important role in their communities. I profiled 23 dance halls in the tri-state area of Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And today we'll look at the 14 Iowa locations and briefly touch on the others. First up is the Crystal Ballroom in Dubuque. It grew out of an open-air pavilion in a campground area in Center Grove along US 20. And you can see right here is a picture of that pavilion. In 1928, work began on paving the Hawkeye Highway, which is what the stretch of US 20 between Dyersville and Dubuque was called at the time. And that prompted the park owner, Edward Bartles, to construct a permanent, more extravagant building at the site. It opened on Thanksgiving Day of 1928 and was named the Crystal Ballroom, after the handmade mirrored globe that hung from the ceiling above the dance floor. 50 years later, we'd be calling those disco balls. And since this place is on the outskirts of Dubuque, management offered limousine rides in a red Packard from various intersections in downtown Dubuque. Had the good fortune of talking to two of the owner's granddaughters, and they had an interesting story to share. Apparently during World War II, Coca-Cola was rationed. So their grandfather would drive these two little girls around Dubuque, stopping at the taverns and sending them in to buy a six-pack of Coke, which he would then turn around and make available for sale at the ballroom. The Crystal Ballroom attracted such big band names as Lawrence Welk, Tiny Hill, and Les Brown and his Band of Renown. One of the employees, who's kind of a bigger fellow named Francis Hardy, He somewhat served as an attraction at the ballroom. He was a custodian, but he was also an excellent dancer, and the women would just wait in line to take their turn on the dance floor with the man they nicknamed Dreams. And he also was a presence at another one of the area ballrooms, Melody Mill, which we'll get to later. The ballroom's last night was December 31st, 1950, with regional favorite Tom Owen and his Cowboys taking the stage. And in researching these ballrooms, I learned just how popular these cowboy bands were in the from the mid 40s through the 1950s. And it was largely because of stars like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. And you can look down below here on the left, and that's the building. It still exists today. It sits down a little bit from the highway. Now hosts a shoe store and a bike store. But you can always see that if you drive by Highway 20. At right, we have Union Park. In the 1890s, a local electric company established a park in a valley at the end of its trolley line north of Dubuque to encourage ridership. So they created this fabulous park. I mean, it had everything. Roller coasters, a fish pond, a kid's playground, a massive theater, bowling alley, archery. And of course, then they said, hey, if you want to come see this, hop on one of our trolleys, drop in a nickel, and we'll take you there. So it's quite a good marketing scheme. It was first known as Stewart Park, but later was renamed Union Park after it was bought out by the Union Electric Company. In July of 1919, a flash flood tore through the valley, killing 5 picnickers and destroying the park. Of course, it was later rebuilt and included a new dance hall that was initially called Sylvan Ballroom and later renamed Woodland. I think the funniest story out of there was in 1928, kind of during the height of the dance marathon craze. They held a dance marathon at the park that lasted 19 days. And during that contest, one couple got engaged and married right there on the dance floor. And another couple, during the marathon, boarded a flatbed truck. They were transported to Galena, Illinois, which is about 15 or so miles into Illinois there from Dubuque. And they were dancing the whole way. They got off at a ballroom in Galena, won a foxtrot contest, jumped back on the flatbed, transported back to Union Park, where they outlasted all the other couples to win the marathon. Some of the notable performers at the park included Duke Ellington, Art Castle, and Ted Weems. And at the ballroom's final show on October 9th, 1933, Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians played. In 1934, Union Park's dance hall was dismantled and the lumber was transported down the valley to a large expanse of land that once housed a horse racing track and later the city's airport. The material was used to construct what would become the area's largest and finest ballroom, Melody Mill. The mill featured all the popular big bands of the day, hosted barn dances, sponsored by local radio station KDTH, was a venue for wedding dances. And of course, dances were not held during Lent, so the hall could be rented for boat shows, wrestling matches, and club dinners. I was fortunate to speak to the owner's son, Merle Schulting. He's pictured here at right. He actually managed the ballroom for its final 10 years. Unfortunately, Merle passed away just 2 weeks after my second interview with him. It was a bit bittersweet. He's such a gentleman. But I was at least glad to be able to record his memories to pass along and share with others. He had one funny story. I guess when Brenda Lee, she had appeared at Melody Mill several times, and I guess during her first visit, she was just 12 years old, and so it's kind of left up to him to keep an eye on her. She just wanted to, she's 12. She just wanted to run around the facility and play and explore, and so it's kind of his duty to keep an eye on her. So essentially, he babysat Brenda Lee. And upper right here, you can see we've got photos of some of the performers, and I'll zoom in on those. Here in the left photo, I guess before he became the man in black, he was the man in white. That's Johnny Cash with his white sport coat with the silver trim. And he is with Vi Schulting, the owner, and her 2 daughters. At right, we have owner Vince Schulting with Guy Lombardo. And I'll scooch ahead here to the next page. I've enlarged these photos too. Left, we've got Jerry Lee Lewis with a fan. And I think it's kind of neat in this photo. You can see the banner behind him promoting some of the future appearances. In the middle, Louis Armstrong caught with his pants down backstage. And at right, country singer Marty Robbins performing there in the 50s. A change in Iowa's liquor laws in 1963, coupled with the death of Vi Schulting, pretty much spelled the beginning of the end for Melody Mill. Final dance was held August 10th, 1964, and followed soon thereafter by an auction of the contents. And Dubuquers just showed up in droves to grab themselves a souvenir because this place was wildly popular during its time. And just 2 months after it closed, the building was demolished, October of '64. And as part of this project, we solicited readers' memories of the place, and I'll share a few of those with you. One woman recalled the time that she had Johnny Cash autograph her hand, and her boyfriend was nearby, and he was not happy with that, and he threatened to beat up Johnny Cash. Well, that got him tossed out of the ballroom, and then she tells me she ended up marrying this fellow. Another woman who's pictured here at the left. She and her husband farmed in Dubuque County, and I guess one morning they found an owl out in their barn. So her husband captured it and placed it, I believe it was in a burlap sack or some kind of bag with holes in it. So anyway, they were going to a winter dance at Melody Mill that evening. So he smuggled the owl in under his coat, and during the middle of the night, just let it loose in the building. And of course, it started flying all over. Women were screaming and caused quite a commotion. And at right, this gentleman here, he told about the time he met singer Wanda Jackson when he was just 19. She had just come off the stage, and of course, he was quite enamored with her. He picked up her full-length coat, which was nearby, helped her put it on, then pulled her toward him, and in his words, kissed her flat on the mouth. And I assume that probably happened after this photo was taken. So he's got no black eye to show for it. And some of the other performers, it's kind of a who's who of stars. Other performers at Melody Mill included Count Basie, the Dorsey Brothers, Spike Jones, Sammy Kaye, Les Brown, Tiny Hill, Andy Williams, Roy Acuff, Patsy Cline, Carl Perkins, Gene Vincent, the Everly Brothers, and the Beach Boys. And Merle Schulting, he could not verify or discount the longtime Dubuque rumor that his parents turned down an offer for Elvis Presley to play there. He said he thought it was pretty doubtful that they would have booked him, given his high price tag and the fact that Dubuque seemed far too Catholic to tolerate his gyrations. Some bonus slides here that did not appear in the magazine. I just wanted to share those with you. Some of the other singers who performed at Melody Mill. Upper left, you can see Lawrence Welk dancing with Darlene Kirch, the owner's daughter. Down below, we've got Conway Twitty at the bar, which featured this magnificent sailfish mounted behind it. In the middle here, we've got Brenda Lee during one of her subsequent appearances. To the right at top here, Stonewall Jackson. And the far right, singer Sonny James. And down below, sitting between Vince and Vi Schulting is Ray Anthony. And just a little about Ray Anthony, if you're not familiar with him, he first played with the Glenn Miller Orchestra and later fronted his own band. He, for a while, was married to actress Mamie Van Dorn and is still alive today at age 102. Some of his most recognizable recordings are The Bunny Hop, The Hokey Pokey, and the theme to the Dragnet TV show. On February 10th, 1959, Buddy Holly and his Winter Dance Party tour was scheduled to play at Melody Mill, but as we know, a plane crash 8 days earlier changed music history. At the lower right, you'll see an ad that appeared later, noting that the show must go on. So Jimmy Clanton, Dion and the Belmonts, Frankie Sardo filled in, and they joined the Crickets, and so did Frankie Avalon, who's shown here in the dressing room that night. Several years ago, and I noted this in a magazine, Jim Klein, who's a longtime area musician, in fact, he played at Melody Mill on that final dance night. He came across a collection of recordings made by a now deceased area musician, and he was surprised to hear a performance by Johnny Cash at Melody Mill among the songs. So anyway, he cleaned up the audio in the recording studio in the basement of his house and made digital copies on a CD. And I'd like to play you a few excerpts from that show, focusing more on Johnny's kind of joking around and bantering with the crowd. Seemed like he really liked to have fun with the audience. And if you'll note here before I start, the photo on the upper right, when I first saw this photo, I wasn't convinced it was Johnny Cash. I knew it was at Melody Mill because of the M logo above him, but then when I learned that it's the same jacket that we saw in that previous photograph, the white with the silver trim, that convinced me that it indeed was. We weren't initially sure of the date of these recordings, but you'll hear a man named Andy Dahl, who fronted his own band, introducing Johnny Cash, and Johnny thanks him later, mentioning his name. I did find this ad here in the upper right, June 6th of 1958, that mentions Johnny Cash and Andy Dahl at the Melody Mill on the same night. So that's likely when this was recorded. So let me play you a little bit here. First, Johnny Cash being introduced, and then later he'll introduce his band.
Hey, Mike, this is Rachel. I think we cannot hear your sound sharing. It has to be enabled on the share presentation feature.
Oh, is there a problem there?
Yeah. We could try to share here if you click share at the bottom of your screen where you're sharing your presentation.
Okay, would that be
The green.
your screen sharing?
Yep. I think if you click that, there might be a button in the bottom left that says share sound.
I do not see that.
We may not be able to hear your sound, unfortunately, then on this presentation.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, trust me, it's pretty unique to hear Johnny Cash on stage. At one point, he imitates Elvis, and I do have a little clip of that, and then maybe we can figure this out later and possibly add it to the presentation. Okay, next up we have in downtown Dubuque, we have the Eagles Hall from 1924 to 1936. There was a dance hall located on the third floor and later the second floor of the Eagles Hall in downtown Dubuque. And during that short time, it went by three names. And you can see the ads at the bottom here, Parkside, then it was Danceland, and finally College Inn. Local radio station used to broadcast a weekly show from there, hosted an amateur show with a $15 first prize. And probably the most famous band that played there, Herbie Kay and his great orchestra, which featured singer and future Hollywood star Dorothy Lamour. Next, we'll move out of Dubuque into Durango, Iowa. From 1935 to 1950, a dance hall known as the Dells and later New Dells Ballroom operated in Durango, a town with a current population of just 20, just north of Dubuque on Iowa Highway 3, formerly US 52. And the property included picnic grounds, cottages, a restaurant, and auto repair shop, and it was marketed as a suburban resort. I was able to talk with the daughter of the owner, who recalled a time when she met a black traveling musician who was seemed a bit dejected. He was sitting on the stoop out front of the place. Told her he had just broken a guitar string. And she was just a little girl at the time, but she asked him, why can't you just go to the store and replace it? And he told her that he wouldn't be allowed in the store. And she recalled that he eventually did get a replacement string, but it left quite an impression on her. Just kind of a sad sign of the times there. If you've ever toured Northeast Iowa in the fall, you might be familiar with Balltown. It's got a spectacular scenic overlook of the Mississippi River Valley, and it also houses the state's oldest restaurant, Bright Box Country Dining. There's also used to have Pape Ballroom. Pape's was opened by George and Lenore Pape in 1936, and it underwent several name changes in later years, becoming Deerland, J. Whitty's, Great River Roadhouse, before closing in the early 1990s. And just a couple tidbits on this ballroom. It was May of 2022. I received an email from a cousin of mine, and she told me that they're about to tear down Pape's Ballroom. And this really piqued my interest and essentially inspired me to create this magazine to document and preserve the legacy of the area's ballrooms. Secondly, I had a bit of a connection with this place because in the 1980s, my brothers and I had a rock band, and we actually played here once. Had no idea it was had such a history as a ballroom at that time. It seemed more like a roadhouse when we played there. At right, we've got Imperial Gardens and the Memorial Worthington Hall in Worthington Memorial Hall in Worthington, Iowa. From 1930 to 1949, Worthington had the Imperial Gardens Dance Hall that hosted many regional bands, including Speed Webb, Clyde Grant, Don Hoy, Leo Piper, Larry Foster, and Leo Greco. In 1953, the 850-seat Worthington Memorial Hall opened, and its first guest was none other than Minnie Pearl. More recent performers have included Mark Chestnut, Tracy Bird, the Bellamy Brothers, and Sawyer Brown. Another side note, our band also played here. At bottom, we have the Empire Ballroom in Manchester, Iowa, that opened in 1932 and featured many touring bands, among them Clyde Grant and his Iowans, Fred Dexter and his Pennsylvanians, L. Curley and his Collegians, Cleo Irene and her all-girl band, and Herb Hoyer's Vagabonds. I love those names. From the 1960s to the late 1970s, it became the Empire Q Cafe and Roller Rink and still hosted occasional dances. The building was demolished in 1991. Next up, we have Lakeside Ballroom, Guttenberg, Iowa. That opened in 1927 by Edmund and William Cann, who wanted to create a stage for their performances of their musically talented family. Ballroom's name, as you can see in the photos, was spelled out in large letters on the roof, which provided a navigational aid for pilots. Edmund's nickname was Sonny, and he also was a pilot and reportedly used to fly in moonshine from Chicago during Prohibition and land on the grassy strip right next to the ballroom. Many of the top big band orchestras appeared here, including Kay Kaiser, Eddie Howard, Ted Fiorito, Art Castle, Wayne King, and Lawrence Welk. And dancers would travel here by auto or boat or train, since it was located near the railroad tracks and the Mississippi River. And you can see down at the lower right, surrounded by floodwaters here during the infamous 1965 Mississippi River flood, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was prepared to scuttle the building with dynamite should it become dislodged from its foundation and threaten the nearby lock and dam. So unfortunately, they never had to put that plan in action. Some of the post-big band entertainers that appeared here included Bobby V, Dion and the Belmonts, the Grassroots, Mickey Gilley, Tommy James, and Herman's Hermits. The ballroom was inducted into the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001 and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It still operates and holds occasional dances. It retains much of its original architecture, and I encourage you to stop by and see it sometime if you're in the area. It's certainly a relic of the big band era. At right, we've got the New Vienna Community Hall in New Vienna, Iowa, which is just north of Dyersville, if you know where that's at, Field of Dreams. And like Lakeside, this dance hall is nearly 100 years old. It debuted in 1927 after townspeople voted to approve construction of the building. Lloyd Wells and his 9-piece orchestra provided the music on opening night, and more than 1,100 people attended, and that's not bad for a town whose current population is about 375. And it was such a successful venue that it took only 10 years to satisfy the bonds for the project. Some of the musical acts included Virginia Ravens Orchestra, Bobby Griggs and his orchestra, Moeller's accordion band, and as you can see in that lower ad, Whoopie John. And here's just a little about Whoopie John. He was a concertina player from New Ulm, Minnesota, who led a polka band. And his stage name was only slightly better than his real name, which was John Anthony Wilfart. Lombardi's Ballroom in St. Catherine, Iowa, just southeast of Dubuque, that opened in 1973, and that's the most recent ballroom I featured. Notable performers there included Mickey Gilley, Billy Crash Craddock, Jeannie C. Riley, Eddie Howard and his orchestra, and Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra. It is no longer a dance hall. The area where the dance floor was, I believe, has been subdivided. Another personal fun fact, my four brothers and I all had our wedding receptions here. Just was set up really nicely with a large dance floor, stage at the end, and tables along each side. So it was really easy access to the dance floor for the crowd. At Wright, Lakehurst Pavilion, it was located below a dam along the Maquoketa River, just west of Maquoketa, Iowa. The dam and the ballroom were constructed at the same time in the early 1920s. And Maquoketa banker and Jackson County supervisor, pictured here, Abraham Hurst, was involved in both of those endeavors. And the arched roof dance hall was a larger part of a larger picnic and recreation area, and you can see that in the lower photo. You can see the dam in the background and the ballroom here along the shore. Some of the band leaders who performed there were Ted Weems, Ted Fiorito, and Wayne King. And unfortunately, the venue was destroyed by fire following a dance in May 1936. Next up is Melody Park in Preston, Iowa, and there's a little prehistory with that. In the summer of 1930, a recreational area known as Lake Farleywood opened just east of Preston, Iowa. It included ball fields, miniature golf, horseshoe pits, a picnic area, a campground with prefab cabins, and a lake. And a couple amenities on this lake. They had homemade boats crafted from 2x10 planks with a sheet of tin. You could use those to paddle around the lake, or you could, they had a zip line style swing where you could slide right down the cable into the lake. So there was some fun things they had going there. And it also had an open air dance pavilion. A series of setbacks that included a fatal crash of a barnstorming plane, a flash flood, and the effects of the Great Depression eventually closed the park. However, the property was purchased in 1941 by Albert and Louise McNeil, who farmed nearby. They're pictured here at left. And one of their first orders of business was improving the leaky and dilapidated dance hall. Albert cut all the wood by hand, no electricity, of course, out there in the boonies, and he enclosed and re-roofed the structure. And the site was rebranded as Melody Park after the name was selected from those entered in a contest on its opening night on July 13th, 1946. And the Oklahoma Cowboys provided the music that evening. Many of the regional acts, especially those kind of focused, specializing more in country and cowboy music, performed there, including Leo Greco, Kenny Hofer, Clarence Zahina, Leo Beshen, Cedar Valley Cowboys, Frank Burr, Andy Dahl, Johnny Kettleson, and Don Rhines Ridge Riders. The final dance was held in July 1961 with the Oklahoma Cowboys providing the music, just as they did for the park's opening 15 years earlier. And that does it for the Iowa ballrooms. I'll briefly touch on some of the others you might find interesting. Just across the river in Illinois, Menominee, which is a small town between East Dubuque and Galena on US 20. You have Moonlight Gardens. This was actually started by Vince and Vi Schulting, who later ran Melody Mill. They started Moonlight Gardens in 1931. It was later owned by Thomas Francis Cashman, who at one time owned Pape's Ballroom in Balltown and 3 other ballrooms in the region. And an interesting thing here at the upper right, and I will zoom in on that. You see the woman here posed with the Everly Brothers, and that is the same woman we saw at Melody Mill posed with the Jerry Lee Lewis. And kind of an interesting story. When I first started this magazine, we solicited memories and input from readers. And one woman called me and said she had a photo album I'd probably want to look at. So I stopped at her place, and she had gotten the album from an antique dealer. So she didn't know the original owner, and inside was all these photographs taken at the area ballrooms, including her and some other folks with some of the singers that appeared there. So that was kind of a nice treasure to come across. And this ballroom closed in the early 1960s. A little further down the road along US 20 in Galena, Illinois, we've got the Royal Palace. And Highway 20 was really kind of a pipeline from Chicago. A lot of the touring bands would use that to head west out of Chicago, and they'd, if they had some open dates, they'd stop at these places and play. And the Royal Palace was a fairly good size and a respectable location, and they were somewhat of a rival to the Crystal Ballroom and Melody Mill in Dubuque. Some of the bands that played there, as you can see by the poster, Guy Lombardo, also Lawrence Welk, Tiny Hill, and the Dorsey Brothers. And at right, we've got the Grandview Pavilion. That is in Elizabeth, Illinois, just a little further east on Highway 20 from Galena. And the Grandview Pavilion operated there from mid-20s to the mid-40s. Hopping up into Wisconsin, the tiny little town of Rockville, Wisconsin, had White's Ballroom, which was constructed by Bill White circa 1937. And we're fortunate to find quite a few photos of this place here, given to us by his granddaughter, pictured there at left, Susie Wilhelm. It shows the steam shovel they used to level the land, and below that, you've got they're pouring the concrete for the dance floor. This, however, was destroyed by fire in June of 1977. And then north of Dubuque on US 61 in Grant County, we've got the Twilight Ballroom in Dickeyville, established in 1937. And much like White's Ballroom, this dance hall featured a lot of local country-flavored bands. Closed in 1962. The building still exists, as you can see in the photograph here, but it now houses apartments. And a little further north on US 61, you've got the Rainbow Palace in Fenimore, Wisconsin. This building started out as an auto garage, began hosting dances in 1924. It was furloughed during World War II when the site was used to manufacture fuses for shells. Dancing resumed, but the building later returned to industrial use once more. In the 1970s, I believe it was, the roof collapsed, and after much remodeling, the building looks totally different today. It still exists, but it now hosts a roller skating rink. I'm going to skip to the right-hand side page here for a moment. Checkerboard Ballroom in Prairie du Chien, up in Crawford County. It's got the arched roof, much like Melody Mill or the Rainbow Palace we just saw. This operated from 1947 to 1967. And it's now home to a fireworks outlet, smoke shop, and a store called Cheapo Depot. Back to the left here, Modernistic Ballroom in Boscoville, Wisconsin. And this is quite the hidden gem. I had heard about this ballroom in the course of my research, and learned that it was on the second floor of this old building here in downtown Boscoville. So I knew I had to take a trip up there, and I'll give you another bonus slide here. I learned that they had taken out the staircase to the second floor decades earlier. It might even have been 1970s or 80s. And so when I got there, the owner had propped an extension ladder here. The only way to get into the place was up this extension ladder into the 13-foot ceiling. So I climbed up there and came through this doorway here, and it was just wowed at this place. I mean, it's like a time capsule from the 1930s. It's got all the Art Deco motifs. It's got these bright tin sconces that line the walls. You can see up in this bigger picture here on the ceiling, there used to be chandeliers hanging from that. Still got the half dome band shell in really good shape. And at left here, that's what it looks like from behind, how they constructed that thing. But quite the sight to see, and I'd love to see that restored someday. Lawrence Welk was the biggest name to perform here, and the hall closed in 1954 because the swaying and the vibrating of the dance floor was impacting the retail business below. Items were starting to get rattled right off the shelf. In the 1970s, I'm going to go back a slide here. In the 1970s, they had to put these cables in, anchored to the floor joists here, and that was to stabilize the building's facade, which was starting to become detached from the building. So this facade here is partially being held in place by these cables. Might impede dancing a bit. The last ballroom I featured is the Driver Opera House in Darlington, Wisconsin, and this has been around since the early 1900s. You can see it here, this building at right in the lower photo. But it was mothballed in 1951 because of concerns over its structural integrity. Much like the modernistic, the dance floor was getting a little wobbly. It's currently in the midst of, or probably more at the tail end of, a $4 million renovation, and has hosted a few events in recent years. At right, I've included this map in the magazine just to kind of show people the locations of each of these ballrooms. And when we do these projects, we try to spread the love, so to speak, and try to find some in each of our coverage areas, so they're not all bunched in Dubuque or one certain area. So that's where all those 23 ballrooms were located. Next, we'll turn to the bands that I featured here. A lot of these very popular and famous bands. The local bands are featured here, but it was just amazing the diversity of musical talent that appeared at the ballrooms. Local, regional, national acts, everything from big bands to cowboy and country music to rock and roll. And I was just amazed. The musicians seemed so versatile. They often sat in with other bands at a moment's notice if someone couldn't make it to a gig. And it's just amazing how they would seem to know all the songs, or at least be able to read the music. So quite a bit of talent there. And first band is Leo Beshin and his Cowboys. They formed around 1945 and played off the singing cowboy craze. And I just love this photograph. It shows all the band members with their instruments in front of their bus with the logo on it in front of Melody Mill Dance Hall, which was pretty much the premier dance hall in the area. So it's got everything going for it. Next up is the Kothi Melody Kings, and this band was fronted by the four Kothi brothers, circa 1960 to 1970. I was able to speak with a couple of them. Irv is pictured here at the bottom with the saxophone at Lakeside Ballroom, which is not far from his home. And as you can see, the Lakeside still retains a lot of that original decor. The lattice work on the ceiling is pretty amazing. And a lot of Art Deco style light fixtures in there as well. And their name originated from these music stands that they bought secondhand and already had Melody Kings written on it from a previous group. So they just added their name above it and named themselves the Kothi Melody Kings. And they did have the distinction of playing the very last show at Melody Mill in 1964, which is a nice segue to our next band, because Jim Klein here, who formed the Countrymen, sat in with the Kothi brothers that night. So he was also at that last performance. And Jim, by the way, is the area musician who discovered those Johnny Cash recordings. Then we have Clarence Zahina and his Barnstormers. This is a very popular cowboy-style band fronted by accordionist Clarence Zahina, and is featured two of his daughters here at right, and also a third daughter down below. Join them later. They had their own Dubuque radio show in the 1940s, and also made frequent appearances on television stations out of Waterloo, Cedar Rapids, and Madison, Wisconsin in the 1950s. At right is the Country Kings, formed by Fritz Ames. And when I went to Fritz's house, I noticed he had this photograph of himself taken 60 years earlier with the saxophone. So we kind of tried to recreate that for his portrait. Fritz is also in this picture here up front. He played with Leo Beshin and his Cowboys when he was just a teenager. And I enjoyed shooting these photographs of these band members. They were really appreciated their willingness to pose for me. And I initially viewed it as kind of a last man's club or last woman's club in Mary Jane's case, but eventually looked upon it as photographically compiling an all-star band of yesteryear. The Oklahoma Cowboys. This was a Jackson County band, and I kind of considered it somewhat of a super group of country musicians of the era. Many of them came from other notable bands in the area. At bottom right, Glenn Red Henton. Really enjoyed talking to Red, one of the members of that Oklahoma Cowboys. He was just gracious and complimentary and had such a positive spirit, and was willing to pose for me with a vintage guitar I brought along because I had heard that he had just gotten rid of his guitars, I believe, earlier that year. But he did bring his own cowboy hat. And as far as I know, he's still living at the Senior Center in Maquoketa. He was 102 when I photographed him. That was about 2 years ago. And he still holds the world record for the most ringers in a horseshoe game at 175. And if you don't believe me, you can look it up. Red Henton, Maquoketa. Jack Bush Orchestra. This was a Wisconsin-based band consisting of 4 brothers, a nephew, and a son. All 6 of them were farmers, and one of their relatives mentioned to me, I loved his quote. He said, they were a working band. They'd milk the cows, go play a gig, come back home and milk the cows again. No strangers to hard work. At right, we have the Joey Paradiso Orchestra. Joey was a Dubuque musician who was somewhat of a boogie-woogie bugle boy, you might say. He learned to play trumpet as a child, but really honed his musical skills in a military band during World War II. He was very popular in the Dubuque area, and he was friends with Vince Schulting, and his orchestra became the de facto house band at Melody Mill, which Vince ran. Irv Bear and his orchestra. Irv was a Dubuque accordionist and quite a professional band leader. He insisted on union musicians only. Had a lot of natural musical talent and always put on an entertaining show, which sometimes included short skits in between songs. Someone told me the story of one of his band members, Harley Grant, who would occasionally entertain by playing the clarinet and the saxophone at the same time. Not sure how he pulled that off, but that sounds pretty amazing. At right is a group I'm sure some people have heard of, even if they're not from the Dubuque area, Wayne King and his orchestra. Wayne King was a native of Savannah, Illinois, just southeast of Dubuque, and he went on to national fame once he took the reins of the band at Chicago's Aragon Ballroom. He did give Lawrence Welk his first big break by inviting him up on stage to join the band during a show at which Lawrence played his accordion. Wayne earned the nickname the Waltz King for his danceable and melodious music. His shows were broadcast live on WGN radio, and from 1949 to 52, he had a television show broadcast on NBC. Larry Foster Orchestra. Larry Foster actually was a pseudonym for Dubuquer Maury Germain, and he came up with the name in a spur of the moment when asked for the band's name while he was booking his first gig. Maury also got his start in the Bus Canfield Orchestra, pictured below there. And he became friends with nationally known band leader Eddie Howard. And when Eddie Howard passed away, his wife gave all of his music to Maury Germain. So Maury inherited quite a musical archive there. At right, we have the Andy Dahl Band. Andy was a musician from Wisconsin who joined and later took over the Iowa band called Don Rhines and his Ridge Riders. The Andy Dahl Band debuted in 1952 and was marketed as 6 men, 16 instruments because of all his multi-talented musicians. They cut several records and were consistently ranked as one of the best Western dance bands from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s by the National Ballroom Operators Association. The group disbanded in 1969, and then Andy turned his attention to the Coliseum Ballroom in Oelwein, Iowa, where he lived. He had purchased that a few years earlier, so he was, I guess, a longtime owner of that ballroom. Now we'll move into the rock and roll era. Two Dubuque bands, the Shades and Dick Busher and the Clichés, had a couple things in common. First, they both shared a drummer, Bobby Greenwood, who's pictured here at the lower right. And secondly, they've both been inducted into the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Shades were pretty much an epitome of a garage band of the day. They covered songs by Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly. But they eventually opened for national acts such as Jimmy Gilmer, Bobby Rydell, and Bobby V at Melody Mill. Dick Busher, here in the middle holding a guitar. Dick Busher, however, honed his guitar skills in a service band while stationed in Okinawa while he was a Marine. Busher played rockabilly-flavored music, and he and the Clichés produced several records, and I believe Run Boy Run was their biggest hit, had a lot of regional airplay. However, Dick was killed in 1969 when the plane he was piloting crashed near Oelwein, Iowa. And another personal side note, Dick's nephew was the guitarist in the band that my brothers and I had, and Mark continues to play today in my brother's band, often using his uncle's red Gibson guitar. Another Dubuque band that's also in the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is Lavender Hill. The band was formed in 1964 by John Walicki, who initially named the group Lavender Hill Mob after a 1951 British movie, but had to change the name and the spelling after receiving a cease and desist order from the studio. The band played a lot of 1950s rock initially, but evolved into some harder rock of the late 60s and early 70s. Which earned them the reputation of the loudest rock band in the Tri-States. Walicki, however, was a dedicated and professional musician. The band's last gig was in 1979 on the same night that John's first child was born. So you know how having a family can change your priorities just like that. The photo at the lower right here shows the band reunited in 2011 for a benefit performance. Walicki, however, has since passed away, but his widow established a music scholarship in his name, so that's kind of nice for some budding musicians. The last band we have is the Natives. The Natives were a Galena, Illinois area band that were inspired by the 1960s British invasion. They started as a garage band of high schoolers in 1965 and ended up headlining shows at many area dance halls, including the Royal Palace in Galena, pictured there in the upper right, at their very last show. The members considered the Beatles as their heroes, and funny story, they had a friend who lived in New Jersey, and this friend would mail them the latest Beatles releases. And so the Natives, they would take these records and learn to play the songs right away and start playing them out before these Beatles songs ever received airplay in the Galena area. And they said one time someone came up and told them, "I really love your song, Nowhere Man." So it's pretty funny. The group played its last show on May 31st, 1969, with its final set being all Beatles songs. And lower right here, a couple of the band members still play in the area. They call themselves Sunshine, and still going strong for after 50 some years. And I wanted to end the magazine with a quote from the daughter of one of the band leaders. I thought Nancy Germain, whose father was Maury Germain, aka Larry Foster, perfectly summed up the ballroom experience when she said, as you can read, dancing was important. It wasn't sitting and listening. It was all about dancing. And I superimposed that quote over a photograph of Wayne King leading the band at the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago. And that's all I have for now. If you're interested in looking at a copy of any of the magazines, I've listed the Telegraph Herald's website there. And if you think of a question you want to ask me after today, I've included my email address here. So I will turn it over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Mike. We do have some time to answer some questions. As a reminder, if you do have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom, which you can find on the bottom menu bar. And please note, we may not be able to get to all of your questions. For starters, Mike, here you finished up talking about bands. In your research, did you find a musical genre or an artist or a band that appeared more than others in the region?
Boy, there was just so many bands, and looking through, when I started doing this research, I started going through the Telegraph Herald archives, and we'd have a page in the paper each day, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, that was all um, promoting the local dance halls. They also had restaurants and movie theaters on this page, but the ads just consistently had the same bands. They just bounced from one ballroom to another. There were so many venues around here that there's kind of no shortage of job opportunities for these guys. Um, all these that I featured were just regularly appeared at the ballrooms. I can't say there was one more than the other, but just a lot of good groups in the area.
That's great. We have a question in the chat about any places in Iowa today that are comparable to these ballrooms. Have any of these ballrooms managed to survive or, last through the eras, whether they're still ballrooms or not?
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if I needed to make a distinction between ballrooms and dance halls, and that's probably you could spend all kinds of time debating that. The ballrooms maybe were something a little classier. I would say that Lakeside Ballroom in Guttenberg is a great example of, the ballrooms from that golden age, built in 1927, and it's still got most of the original architecture. I toured through there, and you go in there and you just get this vibe of what it must have been like back in the day when women put on their best dresses and the men had their suits on, and they had a coat check area, which they still have that little room there off to the side if you ever get a chance to go in there. But I'd say, yeah, Lakeside Ballroom is probably the best example of a ballroom from that era that's still around.
And a related question, how did communities at the time engage with and support ballrooms or dance halls that were, in their community or maybe in their local area?
Other than putting ads in the paper, I don't know, and you can see on the at the bottom of the magazine cover here, a lot of posters were used back then to advertise, and talked with the owner of, or the daughter of the owner of Moonlight Gardens in Illinois, and she told me how the family would go out and start plastering posters. I believe the granddaughters of the owner of Crystal Ballroom also told me stories of how they'd get these flyers or posters and use that and word of mouth to let people know the happenings at the ballroom throughout the year. So just a lot of community support. I think a lot of these, especially the smaller towns, knew that the value of having this gathering space. It was so important for the community, and so everybody did their best to support it and promote it.
You shared with us a lot of interesting stories of artists who came through in these areas and some of the owners and their families. We have a question in our Q&A here. Did you learn anything surprising when you were doing your research that you didn't expect to find?
It's probably just the caliber of these musicians who repeatedly came to Dubuque. Lawrence Welk he was here. He was at Lakeside Ballroom in Guttenberg. I believe he was at the Royal Palace in Galena. I even appeared at the Modernistic in Boscobel. Someone who had quite a bit of fame, at least later in his years. I mean, I grew up 6:30 Saturday nights. We all sat down and watched Lawrence Welk show. I'm sure a lot of other people had that experience as well. But he had his own show for many years, and here he was touring all the ballrooms in the Midwest. And same with Guy Lombardo. What's New Year's without the Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians? And he made quite a few appearances around here. And of course, Johnny Cash. Yeah, he says on this recording that it's good to be back in Dubuque for my 15th time. I don't know if he was just exaggerating, because he did say a lot of kind of funny things and probably embellish some of his stories up on stage. But the number of times that he appeared at Melody Mill in Dubuque, it's amazing. And I guess one thing I learned about Johnny Cash, he did a great Elvis Presley impression, and I wish I could have played that recording for you. But there's just a few seconds there where you'd swear it was Elvis Presley singing.
Yeah, we'll have to work on seeing if we can get that audio
Yeah.
connected here for viewers to go back and watch on
Do
our
that.
YouTube page.
Mm-hmm.
Another question in our chat here, were ballrooms Midwestern phenomena, or did other areas of the country have them also where, big artists like Lawrence Welk would play?
As far as I know, that was not a uniquely Midwestern thing. Certainly East Coast and West Coast had the ballrooms. I can't really speak to other areas, but as far as I know, there's a lot of Midwestern tours of some of these bands. I heard that Johnny Cash would essentially have a tour route coming up from like Nashville. He'd kind of follow the Mississippi River and hit all the little cities and towns along the way, and book themselves at those places. So they had their, I guess, the Midwestern circuit. I think that went out to like Kansas City and back to Chicago as well, east to west.
Great, thank you. Those of you that have any last questions, we're down to our last few minutes here. So if you have any last questions, you're welcome to put those in the Q&A. But Mike, inquiring minds need to know, what instrument did you play in your rock band, and do you continue to play or join any shows?
I played bass guitar. My brother, who actually started the band, was the lead singer, and another brother played keyboards. And we actually were a six-piece band, and then two guitarists and a drummer. And we were around for about 2-3 years in the mid to late '80s. And my brother has continued to have bands ever since, up in Milwaukee for a while, and then he's back in Dubuque now and still plays in a band with one of our original guitarists. Like I said, it was Dick Buscher's nephew. Still uses Dick's guitar. I do not play anymore. I was asked to join the band years ago, but with family life, just too many commitments, so I had to politely decline. But it's something being out on stage and seeing the reaction of the crowd and the people dance and the excitement. It's a pretty rewarding thing, and I can see where these musicians really enjoyed that. Yeah, it definitely was fun.
All right, we've got one last question here before we wrap up our webinar. Do you have any upcoming projects or research that you could share about that we can look forward to?
Yeah, right, you can see the Cafes and Drive-Ins magazine that just published in April. That was actually, I'd wanted to include supper clubs with that, and had done plenty of research. And I don't know, a short time before this published, I talked to my editor and I said, I've got so much material, I can break it into 2 magazines. So that's what we're doing. The Cafes and Drive-Ins come out in April, and in October, we're going to have the Tri-States Supper Clubs. So it's, and I know we just had that 101 session on supper clubs a couple of weeks ago. So this will cover Eastern Iowa and into Wisconsin and Illinois as well.
All right, well, we look forward to the Cafes and Drive-Ins and the supper clubs to come. And with that, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we'd like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Mike. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. Looking to learn more Iowa history? You can find and watch over 90 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa Culture YouTube channel. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on August 8th. The topic will be Case Studies in Personal Archaeology, Burials, Cemeteries, and Family Records. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.